All right, let's talk about the huge news shaking up global trade. After a really bitter fight, the trade war between the US and India is, well, it's suddenly over. But the deal that ended it, it's kicking up a massive firestorm. So is this a brilliant economic win for India, or is it a complete sellout of the nation's farmers? Let's get into it.
Okay, so you've got to remember, for almost a full year now, these incredibly high tensions and frankly punitive tariffs have been absolutely hammering Indian exporters. And now, just like that, the conflict is done. So the real questions are, how on earth did this happen so fast? And more importantly, what was the price for this peace? And when I say dramatic, I mean dramatic. Just look at these numbers. The US tariff on a whole bunch of Indian goods has just plummeted. We're talking from an insane 50% all the way down to 18%. I mean, if you're an Indian business trying to sell in the US, this is more than just a sigh of relief. It's a complete game changer.
But there's always a catch, right? This massive win for India, well, it wasn't free, not even close. In fact, the price India paid is what's kicking off this huge political storm back home. So let's unpack it. What exactly was the trade-off here?
Okay, so to really get what this deal is all about, we've got to understand the fight that got us here in the first place. Let's rewind the tape a little bit.
So the year actually started with all this optimism, right? There's this thing called Mission 500, a big goal to hit $500 billion in trade. But by the middle of the year, the talks just slammed into a wall. And it was over two really sticky issues. India kept buying discounted oil from Russia, and the US was really pushing, like they always do, for access to India's very protected agricultural markets. And bam, that's when the US just dropped the hammer, a 50% tariff. And then, silence. Until this week, when, seemingly out of nowhere, we get this breakthrough.
So, what's actually in this thing? What did each side have to give up? Let's break down the core bargain.
It really boils down to a three-step exchange. Step 1, the US slashes those really painful tariffs down to 18%. Simple enough. But in return, India makes two massive concessions. First, it agrees to stop buying Russian oil. Full stop. And second, it agrees to cut its own tariffs on American products with the goal of getting them all the way down to zero over time. That is a huge deal.
And wait, there's more. On top of all that, President Trump announced that India has also committed to buying, get this, $500 billion worth of American stuff. We're talking energy, tech, and farm products over the next few years. That is a staggering amount of money.
So, as you can probably imagine, from the Indian government's point of view, they're framing this as an absolute masterstroke. A huge, huge win for the economy.
And this chart really shows you exactly why they're so happy. At an 18% tariff rate, Indian goods are suddenly cheaper to bring into the US than products from their biggest regional rivals, like Vietnam and Bangladesh. And they're way, way cheaper than anything coming from China. This gives anything with a Made in India sticker a really critical edge on the shelf.
I mean, think about what this could do for huge job-creating sectors like textiles and apparel. It also doubles down on India's big pitch to the world as that China plus one destination. The idea that if you're a big global company, you shouldn't put all your eggs in the China basket. You need a second option, and that second option is India. The potential here is so big, in fact, that Goldman Sachs has already bumped up its GDP growth forecast for India to 6.9%.
Okay, but while the big businesses in India are popping the champagne, there's another side to this, a much angrier side. Opposition parties and, crucially, the very powerful farmer unions, they're calling this a national sellout. Let's dig into why. So first, let's just look at it from the American side. The U.S. Agriculture Secretary didn't mince words. She was crystal clear. The whole point of this deal for them is to finally crack open India's massive market for American farm products. A market, by the way, that's been walled off for decades. And that right there, that quote, gets us to the absolute heart of the conflict. A top farmer union leader, Rakesh Tikait, is calling this a serious blow to an economy that literally supports almost 70% of India's population. The fear, the very real fear, is that a flood of cheap, heavily subsidized American food products could just wipe out the livelihoods of millions of Indian farmers. So this is the point the opposition keeps hammering home. It just looks imbalanced, doesn't it? The US brings its tariffs down to 18%, while India has to bring its tariffs down towards zero. The big question from critics is pretty simple. How is that a fair deal?
But this deal is about so much more than just economics and tariffs.
It's also a massive, massive strategic pivot for India on the global stage. And this chart right here really shows you the biggest geopolitical price tag attached to this whole thing. Look at the before picture. Russian oil, which India was getting at a nice discount, made up a whopping 40% of its imports. Agreeing to just stop that? That's a complete 180-degree turn away from Russia, and a total reversal of the energy strategy India has been following.
And this really hits on a core fundamental principle of Indian foreign policy for decades. It's this idea of strategic autonomy. It basically means the freedom to make your own decisions, to not be tied to any single power bloc. What critics are saying is that by linking its trade and energy policies so tightly to what the US wants, India is basically throwing that treasured independence out the window.
But what about the pure dollars and cents? Well, supporters of the deal will tell you the math is pretty straightforward. Yeah, sure, buying more expensive oil from the US and Venezuela might cost an extra $1.5 billion a year. But the savings from those tariff cuts, they're estimated to be a huge $6 to $7 billion. You subtract one from the other, and India still comes out ahead by over $4 billion a year, net positive.
So here we are, we're left with two completely different narratives, aren't we? On one side, you have the story of a brilliant economic victory, and on the other, a story of a deep political betrayal.
Let's just recap the two cases. The government is saying, look, this is a historic win for Made in India. It's going to create jobs, it makes us a global power, and don't worry, we've protected our farmers. The opposition's case, it's the polar opposite. They're saying this is a surrender of our sovereignty. You sold out our farmers for corporate profits. The deal is totally unequal, and we've just given up our strategic autonomy. Two completely different worlds.
And that's really what makes this moment so incredibly important, so pivotal. It all boils down to one final massive question. Can the very real, tangible economic gains for India's factories and exporters possibly outweigh the potential cost to its millions of farmers and its long-held independent foreign policy? That's the billion-dollar question. And honestly, only time is going to give us the answer.